Welcome back to another episode of Disturbing Truth, where we share disturbing true stories from around the world. Today's video, as the title suggests, is about wicked women. Both are old historical cases, the sort of stories that are half fact and half myth. Since the cases are so old, not all the evidence is verified, so in the end, you have to decide what you think really happened. Delphine Macarty was born on March 19, 1787, in New Orleans, to a wealthy family. Most men in the family had military backgrounds and were landowners. Her father Louis was even knighted. By 1794, her family had an extensive 1,344-acre plantation between Bartholomew and Independence. In the year 1800, she married her first husband, Don Raymond Angulo, who was a highly ranked officer in Spain's Royal Army. As was common for people in their position, he travelled frequently, but Don fell ill within a few years and died in Havana, Cuba, leaving Delphine a young widow with a baby. In 1808, she married again, this time to a banker named Jean Blanc. Delphine had 4 children with Jean, but he too died young, and she was a widow again 8 years later. Delphine married for a third and final time in 1825. This time, her husband Dr. Leonard Lalaurie was quite a bit younger than her, and the two of them moved to a large mansion at 1140 Royal Street, in the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter. This luxurious home became the site of her violent crimes. In public, she treated her slaves with respect, but that was just a ruse, as rumours began to make their way through the French Quarter, alleging that Delphine, and possibly her husband as well, were mistreating them. So a local lawyer was sent to Royal Street to remind Delphine of the laws relevant to the upkeep of slaves. During this visit, the lawyer found evidence of no wrongdoing or mistreatment of the slaves. But soon after, a neighbour saw one of Delphine's slaves, a 12-year-old girl named Leah, fall to her death from the roof of the mansion while trying to avoid punishment. Leah had been brushing Delphine's hair when she hit a snag, causing Delphine to grab a whip and chase her. The body was later buried on the mansion grounds that evening. After this incident, an investigation took place. Delphine was charged with cruelty. 9 enslaved people were removed from her home. However, Delphine managed to use her family's connections to get them all back. I could only imagine the terror the slaves would have felt when they knew they were going back. But the slaves weren't the only ones getting assaulted. Her daughters also copped beatings when they tried to feed the slaves, or even showing them any compassion. In 1834, a fire broke out at the mansion. It began in the kitchen, and when authorities arrived at the scene, they found a 70-year-old black woman chained to the stove. That's when the truth about Delphine's atrocities came out. The cook told the fire marshal that she had set fire in order to commit suicide, because Delphine kept her chained up all day and punished her for the slightest violations. Bystanders, responding to the fire, attempted to enter the slave quarters, which was separate to the house, to ensure everyone had been evacuated. Upon being refused the keys by the family, the bystanders broke down the doors to the slave quarters and found 7 slaves chained to walls, horribly mutilated and tortured, some were even wearing spike collars to prevent movement of the head. When questioned, Delphine's husband told investigators that they needed to just mind their own business. Delphine herself escaped the house, but an angry mob stormed the structure and destroyed it after the discovery of the abused slaves was made public. Following the fire, 2 of the rescued enslaved people died from their injuries. In addition, the backyard was excavated and bodies were uncovered, although one was a child who had fallen from the roof. Reports vary to how many others were buried in the yard. The details of what became of Delphine after the fire is unclear. It is alleged that she fled to France, and according to archival records, she is believed to have died in Paris in 1849. However, there is a plate on her tomb in New Orleans St. Louis Cemetery that reads Madame Lalaurie, née Marie Delphine Macarty, 7th of December 1842, indicating that she in fact died 7 years earlier than what the archives state. Elizabeth Bathory was born in 1560 into one of Central Europe's most important noble families, which owned vast estates across Hungary and Transylvania. She was a sick child and suffered from what we know today as epilepsy. In that day though, they called it the falling sickness. Untreatable at the time, and the only imprecise treatments involved folk remedies, such as rubbing non-sufferer's blood on the lips of the person with epilepsy when a seizure occurred. Researchers have speculated that this supposed treatment was the source of Elizabeth's apparent bloodlust later in life. When she was just 15 years of age, Elizabeth was married to Count Ferenc Nazady, a senior Hungarian noble family member himself. Thousands of Europe's aristocratic lineages attended the wedding on the 8th of May 1575. The young couple settled at the village of Szest in Hungary, where they had an immense castle and estate. Elizabeth oversaw the estate management, while Ferenc was absent in his role as a military commander. The allegations against Elizabeth began during the Long Turkish War, where her husband was, and escalated during her husband's then illness. By the time he died in 1604, rumours were swarming throughout the Habsburg dominions, and as far away as the capital in Vienna, that dozens, perhaps even hundreds of young women and girls had disappeared in Szest at the Bathory castle. Now alarmed, King Matthias II assigned Count Thurzo to investigate in 1610. By the end of the year, he and his aides had collected dozens of statements from supposed witnesses to Elizabeth's crimes, and this figure rose to over 300 witness statements in 1611. The evidence collected was extensive and graphic. Elizabeth had allegedly detained hundreds of women and girls and tortured them, usually to death in her castle. Her methods of torture varied, and it included burning hot irons and needles on them, starving them, beating them, and even freezing her victims. There were even interpretations that she had engaged in cannibalism and both drank and bathed in the blood of her victims. Those she apparently tortured had been either abducted or were the children of prominent Hungarian nobles, who had sent their daughters to Szest to learn the court etiquette at the Bathory household. After collecting their evidence, the authorities moved to arrest her. Finally, on the 30th of December 1610, they entered Szest Castle and arrested Elizabeth, along with several of her senior household servants, who had been identified as accomplices to her crimes. In the weeks that followed, the state decided that the trial would be scandalous and must not be allowed to go ahead. The servants confessed, under torture of course, and were all executed. 2 of them had their fingers torn out with a pair of red-hot pincers and were then burned alive. A younger servant was beheaded, and another one was also burned alive. Instead, they decided to place Elizabeth under house arrest for the remainder of her life. She was confined to a home, but it was a luxurious one and definitely no jail cell. Unfortunately, not long after, on the night of the 21st of August 1614, she died peacefully in her sleep. Digging deeper into this case, there is some conflicting information, with some sources saying there wasn't any evidence to Elizabeth's crimes, and that it was just all hearsay, with possible corruption involved, trying to acquire her vast assets. Whether she was guilty or innocent is shrouded in mystery, but one thing's for certain, her legend lives on. Ilse Koch was born in Dresden, Germany, and she was the daughter of a factory foreman. It's told that she had a pretty regular childhood and was known as polite and happy in her elementary school. She ended up working as a bookkeeper after taking some accounting classes. In 1932, she became a member of the rising Nazi Party. Through some friends, she met Karl Otto Koch in 1934. In 1936, she began working as a garden secretary at one of the concentration camps near Berlin, which her then fiancé commanded. She married him the same year. In 1937, she came to Buchenwald concentration camp when her husband was main commandant. Buchenwald was the largest of the Nazi concentration camps, and yet there were no gas chambers for killing people quickly and effectively. This camp was mainly used to make the prisoners work as slave labour for making things that were of use to the Nazis. Prisoners were generally kept alive for years, which was a lot longer compared to say Auschwitz, where the prisoners only lasted 3 to 4 months before they were killed. Since her husband was the boss, Ilse demanded the prisoners build her a huge indoor sports arena, which was only used so she could practice her horse riding. But the horse riding didn't quell her boredom. There was a rule around camp that if a prisoner even looked at the commander's wife, they would be shot on the spot. Knowing this, she started dressing provocatively, wearing tight clothing. Ilse would command the officers to bring out a group of male prisoners, and force them to undress completely naked. She would stand there in lingerie in front of the prisoners, and if any of them even looked at her body or became aroused, he was immediately taken by the guards and shot dead in the head. She requested only teenage boys to work in her home and bring her breakfast in bed while she was only wearing a nightie. And just like with the older male prisoners, if any of the young boys looked at her body, she would have them killed. Ilse was a sexual sadist who enjoyed watching pain being inflicted on other people. Most of the Nazi camps had human experiments going on, and Buchenwald was no different. The doctors were poisoning inmates with chemicals to find antidotes, and injecting homosexuals with potions to try and turn them straight. Ilse wanted to carry out an experiment for herself, and as she was riding her horse around camp, she noticed one of the prisoners' tattoos. So she approached one of the camp's doctors, Erich Wagner, and suggested carrying out a study to find out if tattoos had any link to criminal behaviour. She began to ride her horse around camp, again commanding men to stop and strip, so she could see if they had any tattoos. The men with the biggest and most interesting tattoos were selected for the medical trial and killed. Sickeningly, she kept the tattoo-covered skin and used it to cover her lampshades and book covers. She even used the skin-covered books and lamps as gifts for her friends. It was also known she was having multiple affairs with other prison guards whenever her husband was away on Nazi duties. In 1942, Ilse and Ilse Koch were arrested and charged for misappropriating the camp's funds, which was used to build her mansion and sports stadium. What the Nazis also didn't like was that she was doing a lot of things off her own back and not getting the clearance from the higher-ups. But the court decided that the final say on how the money was spent and the torture of prisoners was up to Karl. So Ilse was not charged, but Karl was given a death sentence, and in 1945 he was shot by firing squad. Ilse showed no remorse and was free to live with her children back in Germany. That same year, the American troops freed the prisoners at Buchenwald. The German people were invited to the camp to see what horrible things actually occurred there. 80,000 people were crammed into a space that was only meant to house 8,000 people. Corpses lying all around the place, human organs displayed in glass cases, and the household items covered in the skin which Ilse had gotten made. After the testimonies were taken from surviving prisoners, many horrific stories involved Ilse, including a whole crew of Jewish prisoners whose only job was to butcher human bodies and skin them to create the lampshades and book covers. She was quickly rearrested and got pregnant in prison to another German prisoner. She ended up having 4 children in her lifetime, and one of her sons, Artvin, as he grew older and realised how much the world hated his mother, he committed suicide, as he couldn't handle the guilt and shame of his family name. Her daughters got married and changed their last names to try and live a semi-normal life. The child she had in prison was sent to different foster homes, and when he was old enough, he found out who his mother was and tracked her down and met her in prison. Ilse said everything said about her was a lie. He probably knew this wasn't true, but he wanted a relationship with his mother. Uwe would visit his mother once every month, not mentioning her time at the concentration camp much, and just tried to get to know her. Ilse tried to convince her son to try and get a lawyer to set her free. He tried, but it could not be done. The night before one of Uwe's visits, Ilse Koch tied her bedsheets together and hanged herself in her cell. She was 61 years old. By then, Uwe had been manipulated by his mother into believing she was completely innocent of her crimes, and that it was the liberal Americans that didn't give her a fair trial, even though it was the Germans who gave her the life sentence. He had approached the New York Times to try and tell her story, to exonerate his mother, but no one was buying it. Uwe is said to be Ilse Koch's final victim of manipulation. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't already, hit the like and subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next video.